Mark Heim here, founder of Disaster Doc, sharing with you module number 8, landslide disasters. So let's go through those learning objectives again. After completing this lesson, students will be able to define the term landslide, to recognize the economic impact of landslides in the United States and be able to compare those to other areas, and to identify the general range of mortality associated with the world's 10 deadliest landslides. We also want to recognize that landslides have the second highest death to injury rates among all natural disasters and displacement rates among all natural disasters as well. We want to identify the health consequences of landslides, and finally we want to recognize why those measures that lessen the health impact of landslide disasters and how they work. So what is a landslide? Landslide is sort of a generic term for all types of gravity-induced mass movements. Now that's a lot of new words, right? A mass movement is a large movement of soil or large movement of the earth itself, and these are all induced by gravity. So things that go up must go down, right? And so that's driven by gravity in the case of a landslide. And this can range from rock falls, where the actual movement is rock, all through slides as well, and other things that are called slumps, which are different types of movements of the earth itself, avalanches, and also flows, where there's liquid and also the land debris flow tends to move as well. Let's talk about the impact of landslides. These occur in every U.S. state and territory, and the cost in the United States alone is about $1 to $3 billion each year in the U.S. alone. Does that surprise you? It surprised me when I first heard that statistic. It's because landslides are so frequent. That's the reason why we see these losses. In addition, they are very devastating to the infrastructure, the buildings and those kinds of things as well. When a landslide comes through, there's a lot of damage, and so therefore we see these large numbers when we're talking about $1 to $3 billion US dollars every year. I want to talk about this issue of world's top 10 deadliest landslide disasters from 1900 to 2013. So looking basically back over the past 100 years a little bit longer. And I want to show you a little bit about the landslides and the locations and where they've occurred, and to give you an idea of the number of people that were killed. So we're looking at the largest landslide. Actually, it was in Venezuela in 1999, and ironically enough, I was at that area for a response. This is in a case where actually landslides came into the port area of Venezuela. 30,000 people lost their lives in one landslide in one day. Other landslides as well. The Soviet Union in 1949 killed 12,000 people. Another landslide in 1941 in Peru killed 5,000 people. In Honduras, 1973, 2,800, and then smaller amounts as well down to China, 500 in 1934 as being among the top 10. So we can see these aren't huge numbers, but they are still significant in some cases. 30,000 people is a very, very serious number when we're talking about landslides death. But the overwhelming majority of landslides don't cause a lot of deaths, but actually what they do is they have a high fatality rate where they do occur. So the health impacts of landslides are very keen to recognize that the second highest death to injury ratio among all natural disasters are associated with landslides, second only to tsunami. And if you recall, the death to injury ratio is where the number of deaths are compared to the number of injuries. And actually for landslides, that number is almost 4 times more deaths than injuries. And so you can see these are very dangerous phenomenon. Even though they may not have the large reach, geographical reach of a tsunami, the people that they do reach have a very high possibility of being killed by these events. They also have the second highest rate of population displacement among all natural disasters. And this makes sense in geological terms, in terms that they are geological disasters, because they actually damage a lot. When a landslide occurs, it damages shelter, displaces the population, just the same as earthquakes and tsunamis do as well. So these geological disasters really have this impact, and landslides are the second highest rate. So in other words, the number of people per 100,000 people affected, very high number of those people can be expected to be displaced by a landslide. So you hear about a landslide, you should expect the need for shelter among that population is going to be relatively high in comparison to many other types of natural disasters. These major causes of death for natural disasters focused on landslides in this particular issue. Traumatic injury is really the key element of we're talking about causes of death, right? People are injured by this debris as it comes down. In addition, as well, compression of the chest, difficulty breathing because of that compression. Every breath that the person lets out, more compression on the chest, and therefore asphyxia or suffocation also becomes another issue. People can also be covered over by landslides. So the landslide goes way above your head. Of course, people are unable to breathe in that example as well. So landslides, very key causes of death, traumatic injury, and asphyxia. Once again, these are kinds of things when this high death to injury ratio, large numbers of kinds of problems that we really can't solve unless we're there immediately. So this suffocation, if you're covered over by a landslide, you only have minutes to survive. So the issue is prevention, folks. We have to think in terms of identifying these areas and helping people to get away from that, to keep away from those areas so that they're not affected because response is too little and too late. I also want to go through with you some more of the general health consequences of landslide disasters so we can better understand not only the causes of death, but also these causes of other kinds of complications that occur with these disasters. We see the number of deaths and number of severe injuries are few to moderate amounts, once again because landslides are relatively well localized. They're just around the hill itself, and so many times in a landslide disaster what we'll see is actually multiple landslides where multiple hillsides are affected, and I'll share with you a story about that in a particular response that I went on where we saw that kind of phenomenon where multiple hillsides had these slope failures and so on. We also see focal kinds of disruptions, so focal damage to healthcare facilities. If the healthcare facility or hospital is right near where the landslide occurred, then it's affected. If it's off in the distance, of course, it's not a big issue. But once again, focal disruptions of shelter and water and so on, food access and so on, all relatively focalized and local. But of course, as in any disaster, the public concern for safety is quite high. Once landslides occur, especially if you live under another hillside that wasn't affected, you'll never look at that hillside the same again, right? It always then becomes a specter of concern for people, and they then perceive this risk that they may not have perceived before. So we have to think in terms of teaching people how to deal with that concern and also how to protect themselves. You know, a lot of this concern is rightly placed, and so we want to make sure that we can address those kinds of issues for information that people need. There are natural factors that actually contribute to landslide disasters. So nature contributes as well as human factors contribute to the possibility of landslides from occurring. And one of them is erosion. So the erosion occurs by rivers and glaciers. Ocean waves can also create oversteepened slopes, and erosion ends up causing the actual landslide to occur after a while. Rocks and soil slopes are also weakened by saturation, by snow melt or heavy rains. And I responded to a landslide disaster in particular in Micronesia about 10 years ago. And it was this heavy rain of 24 inches of rain in 24 hours came down on these hillsides. And that water just soaked down into the soil. It lubricated it and made it very easy to be able to slip. And we saw these landslides occur in multiple areas. These were actually multiple islands that were associated in a state in Micronesia, a state called Chuuk. And people lived at the bottom of those hillsides and had their villages down at the bottoms. And when the heavy rains came from a typhoon, actually affecting them in that way, many of them were inside their homes because, of course, the wind is blowing and the heavy rains are coming down. And then the next thing you know, landslides started to occur. We saw the same phenomenon in Caracas, Venezuela, in the largest port there in Venezuela, where they were actually on the coastline. Heavy storm coming through as well. Once again, another hurricane that came through, rained and rained and rained because it stayed in one spot, and it rained very heavily. Not a lot of damage from the wind, not a lot of damage from the storm surge itself, but what really happened there is that the soil became so saturated that those hillsides came down, and in that example, 30,000 people lost their lives. In Micronesia, same element, of course, only less population density and multiple landslides. So rather than one or two big ones, they had multiple, 15, 20 on multiple islands. These are relatively remote areas to try to get to. Very difficult to get in there to be able to do search and rescue, to get people out of there, to try to dig for people that may be buried in the debris. And also very difficult to be able to provide medical care for those folks that were scattered among multiple islands. So really big challenge. The sad thing is actually much of that was predictable. There had already been a hazard mapping performed. They already knew where the dangerous places were, but people were still living there, and when these heavy rains came, this tipped them over the edge. Now, earthquakes of magnitude of 4 or greater actually can trigger landslides as well. So you start getting significant ground movement, and that can also cause some of these relatively unstable slopes that would normally have stood up, but a little bit of shaking, and there's a slope failure or a landslide or debris flow that occurs after that. There are also volcanic eruptions that can produce loose ash deposits, heavy rain, that can also cause debris flows as well, and those end up resulting in landslides that are mixed with that lahar that I was talking about earlier. We also have excess weight, that's accumulation of rain or snow, or stockpiling of rock or ores from man-made waste piles, or from man-made structures that may stress these slopes and then cause failure and other structures to come down with them as well. So we can see these multiple factors, especially when we're looking at someone who may have changed the shape or the steepness of that particular slope by human activity. Now, there are measures that lessen the health impact of landslide disasters, and just as we've talked about with many of these other types of disasters, reducing the exposure is so important. It's more important to me, in my own perception after 20 years in this business, reducing people's exposure ahead of time is much more advantageous than coming in afterwards and trying to pick up the pieces and rescue them. I've said this before in an example. It's like the difference between having the absolute best surgeon in the world to patch you up after a car wreck or having seat belts to where you never needed to begin with. Even if I could guarantee that that best surgeon in the world would have the best outcome, you still don't want to go through all that suffering of going to surgery and all that when you can have a pair of seat belts that save your life to begin with or save you from injury. That's the issue with landslides. We have to be able to evacuate populations that are at high risk. And how do we know to do that? We can look and see where these landslides can occur. There's a science and the good geologists out there that can look at these slopes, identify where the areas are at most risk, and of course we can't get this down to the exact day or the exact moment, but we can tell what areas are more likely than others. We can point out the danger and move people towards safety. That's really the issue here. We also want those local folks that live in that area, that know their culture, know their villages, know their towns, know their cities, to be able to participate in these evacuation plans. They learn it, they study it, they inform these plans, and then they exercise it in a way that they can practice the evacuation. Very key thing when we're talking about landslides. And it doesn't have to be something crazy where everyone grabs up and goes and lives in a gymnasium. You know, what we said in Micronesia was actually, these are a lot of small little villages and people don't have a lot of technology. There's no highways in those particular areas. These are all just small towns, right? But we said, hey, if it rains this heavy in the future and we know that you live at the bottom of a landslide-prone hillside, why not go stay with your aunt or your grandma, or your sister, or your brother, your mom or dad when that heavy rain falls? Those people may be actually living outside of that risk zone. So all you have to do when you know that there's going to be heavy rains from a typhoon, maybe just go evacuate ahead of time. Go stay with them. Now, I can't save your house in that kind of example, but I can guarantee you, if you're out of that high-risk area in landslide and you're away from that hillside, you can't be killed. And that's the important thing. You can always rebuild these homes. Obviously, it's a terrible thing to go through, but we can't get you back, right? We can't get your family back. We can't get your friends and communities and so on. So let's think in terms of these sort of careful, innovative ways to evacuate, get out of that area when we think that landslides could occur. In some cases, of course, we can't predict that. These are unpredictable kinds of phenomenon that, we not always predict that. But when we're talking about rainfall and saturation, there's one example right there where we can know a little bit better about when the times that these may occur. We also want to reduce exposures on a community level. Once again, you're not alone. Disasters are a community task. They're, bring us together to be able to work together to save everyone's life. And so we want to maintain systems for hazard mapping. As I mentioned, we can map where those landslides will occur. Some people living on hillsides may want to know, am I at risk? How much is the risk? So these hazard maps are actually color-coded. Red is the most severe, yellow is the moderately severe, and of course green is the best probability. So we can look at those maps relatively simply and identify where our house sits, where our school, where our workplace may be, and identify where our business is. Are our employees, are they at risk when they come to work every day? We can identify where those areas are and make long-term decisions over how better we can reduce our risk over time. That's the key. You have time now. Now's the time to really make the decisions. We can also monitor these slopes. The geologists have ways of monitoring and forecasting, providing some early warning for some of these slopes that may be more at risk than others. And also as well, promoting sustainable development in safe locations. If we know our community has certain areas that may have more risk than others, we really want to be able to promote the development in those areas that we know are safe. It's sustainable over time. In the future, we want our children and our grandchildren to be able to inherit a home that's safe. We want it to be able to outlive us so that we don't have to rebuild, retool, or redesign all these kinds of things because we lose it sometime in the future. Not pass that burden on to our children or our children's children. So think in terms of development that's sustainable. When you build a new building, when you build a new house, you build a new business, is it safe, and can we maintain that on into the future as well? It's also up to communities and governments and so on to recognize and support policies for land use regulation. So sometimes we have to just say, look, this is just too dangerous of an area to develop. Let's use it in other ways where we're not putting our high-risk populations. This isn't a development area. And of course, there's ways to use land other than having people that are sleeping there at night at the bottom of these hillsides. We can lower people's risk of illness and injury and death from these landslides by using a more careful approach to policies that support land use regulation. And the other aspect of this that I love, the reducing vulnerability part, I've lived for this because it's the no regret option. It's improving people's health status, improving personal mobility, improving social network, improving public knowledge and preparedness, and improving communication between neighborhoods, between different ethnicities, between different races, bringing people together, and there's no regret when healthier people, more mobile people, people that can stay mobile long into the extremes of age, better social networks, better communication. There's no regret in all of that. Today, if all of us have those things better in our lives, even if a disaster never happens, we're still better off because of that. And if we can do that for people that are in these high-risk communities, these are healthier, more mobile, more connected people that can communicate and evacuate better. And so that's how we can promote health in order to promote safety and diminish risk from these landslide disasters. And by building capacity in the same note as well, people that have improved access to education, understand the threat, better economic status, we can show that people actually have more choices when they have better economic situations. Better access to health care just means better ability to be able to stay healthy, to be able to be mobile, to be able to evacuate when you need to, or help other people that need your help because you're healthy and you can help them. Healthy communities are resilient communities, so we have to practice large-scale population evacuation. It's an important thing that we have to do in areas that are at high risk. We can maintain public early warning systems as well that really reach out and have the ability to inform all kinds of people, people of different languages, people of different levels of understanding and different levels of development, all need to be plugged into this early warning system. There's a saying about early warning systems, that it's the last mile that's most difficult. The technological components of the early warning system are quite actually easy to put together, just like building blocks, right? But getting that message to people in a way that they can understand it, getting it to them in time, allowing them to understand it and then act upon it in a way that they feel comfortable, that's a difficult task. And we really have to work together because that's really a human task, right? We have to do that person to person to really bring people into the fold, to be inclusive and have social cohesion, to that the information is shared and the risk is shared among people. So we have to think in terms of sharing as opposed to not sharing in these cases. We also want to build resilient critical infrastructure. We want things that will actually withstand these kinds of events. Now, it's very difficult to be able to build any structural building or any structure whatsoever that's going to withstand a landslide. You're talking about a lot of energy, a lot of power in these things. But we can choose very carefully where we put our critical infrastructure of water, sanitation, water treatment plants, power generation plants, and so on, factories, storage facilities, chemical warehouses, and so on, so that they don't become an additional burden. Let me tell you an example of a very strong, big lesson that I learned early on. So let's go back to that event that occurred in Venezuela in 1999. Here they had the hurricane that settled off the coast and dropped large amounts of rain on those hillsides. And many people actually lived on the hillside, a large number of people in that particular port city. And as that rain fell and the landslide started to occur, 30,000 people lost their lives in that one particular disaster, all of them killed because of the landslide itself. But there was another problem that they were faced after all the landslide was over. That landslide came down, and when it hit the port city, it hit storage facilities where large amounts of chemicals were stored in warehouses. And when it hit those ports, it reached into those warehouses and it mixed a lot of those chemical storage barrels and containers and so on, mixed it all together. Well, it's one thing to have it mixed together sitting there in that mud and nothing blew up right then. But as they were digging it out, they realized, wow, if we have these two chemicals touch each other, even touch, they could explode. And some of the modeling that was done by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in the United States looked at some of those chemicals and they said, wow, you know, this could be 5-kilometer crater, a 5-kilometer explosion from just these few chemicals if they mix together. So they had this natural disaster, this landslide, that when it hit this certain type of critical infrastructure, it hit their port, it created another huge problem that could potentially actually have killed even more people. The modeling that we did of that particular chemical infrastructure and the ability to be able to mix those chemicals together with a resultant explosion, we estimated that over 80,000 people would have lost their life from that one explosion and the resultant chemicals that went up in a plume and then affected people's lives and welfare. So here we had one problem of a landslide that was much bigger problem, had that critical infrastructure of the port itself not been placed so close to the landslide area itself. So identifying where that critical infrastructure is located, where it is in regard to these different natural disaster hazards, very keen and important task for many people to think about when we're talking about sustainable development of communities.